You're watching and listening to the Electronic Intifada live stream. I'm Ali Abu Ni'ma here with my colleague Nora Barrows-Friedman. US President Donald Trump convened his so-called Board of Peace for its first major meeting in Washington last week. It was presented as a grand diplomatic breakthrough, but it was nothing of the sort. The gathering assembled US vassal leaders from the region and dozens of marginal states, allegedly to discuss Gaza's future, while Palestinians themselves were almost entirely excluded. But even some of Washington's most loyal European client states boycotted the gathering, although the European Union sent a high-ranking representative, a move which prompted criticism from a number of European governments. Billions were supposedly pledged for reconstruction, but the money, if it ever comes, has many chains attached. The disarmament of Hamas, mercenary occupation troops under the guise of an international stabilization force, and political and social engineering of the Palestinian population designed in Washington. The premise is that Palestinians must first submit politically and militarily before they are permitted to rebuild any of what Israel has destroyed. And they are not the ones who will be allowed to rebuild anyway, with vulture property developers and snake oil salesmen salivating over Gaza as a real estate opportunity to cash in on, a testing ground for dubious crypto scams, or a laboratory for dystopian and totalitarian social control through electronic currencies, tokens, and biometrics. The meeting also signaled Washington's determination to sideline what's left of the United Nations and replace any multilateral bodies with a one-world government run by dictator for life Donald Trump. Joining us now to talk about all of this is Muhammad Shehada. Muhammad is a Palestinian analyst and writer from Gaza and a visiting fellow with the European Council on Foreign Relations. Thank you for joining us once again, Muhammad.
Thanks so much, Ali, for having me. Good to be back.
Good to see you again.
Thanks, Nora.
Mohammed, let's start with this excerpt of former British Prime Minister Tony Blair speaking at that Board of Peace meeting in Washington.
Decades, Gaza's governance has been characterized by extremism, corruption, ineffective institutions, and the complete absence of a route to prosperity for the Gazan people. Yet, as President Trump recognized, its potential has always been vast. 25 miles of Mediterranean coastline, proximity to great regional and global markets, and a young, dynamic population with a median age of 19. So today we set out profound changes necessary to rebuild Gaza for Gazans. Gaza not as it was, but as it should be, including its governance.
Mohammed, Tony Blair went on to paint a vision of a Gaza full of tech entrepreneurs, and he claimed that Trump's so-called 20-point plan is the only hope for Gaza. What's your reaction when you hear Blair's comments? What do they tell us about the mindset of those involved in the Board of Peace and how they view Palestinians, as well as how they see the future of Gaza? In particular, talk about their vision for what they're calling New Rafah.
Well, basically, with Blair listening to these remarks, it deepens my understanding of why Brits like to use the word twat to describe him constantly. The guy is insufferable. Not even his own people can bear the sight of him. There's this sort of schizophrenia in Blair's own words here compared to when he was in the UN, compared to when he was as Prime Minister of the UK. So when he was having this job as the UN envoy or quartet something for Palestine, he said verbatim, we were wrong to boycott Hamas in 2006. We could have done business with them. We could have established a common ground with them. When he was Prime Minister, he even allowed 2 Hamas leaders into the UK to exchange knowledge and experiences in Northern Ireland. They went and visited Belfast and toured and met with loyalists and separatists and tried to he even arranged meetings with them with The Guardian and other newspapers and the House of Lords, House of Commons, and mainly not because of Blair having an interest in this. He had just some critical-minded chief of staff back then, Jonathan Powell, who thought that we need to try things differently. Now you're dealing with a moral carcass, a rotting corpse. He's talking about Gaza as an issue of bad governance without a single mention of Israel. He's been to Gaza. He took selfies with the rubble in my own neighborhood in 2014. He saw everything in there with his own eyes. Not a single mention of the destruction. It's just a problem of bad governance. And the solution that he proposes with the clique of entrepreneurs or of misery is basically we need to, as you, Ali, said, we need to use Gaza as an opportunity for business vultures to make the most profit out of it. So the idea of New Rafah was born as a dystopian mix. It's a mix together Mad Max, Fallout, Hunger Games, Minority Reports, etc., and put on top of it Squid Game to make the sort of capitalist profit. And that's how you end up with New Rafah. So it's supposed to be a concentration camp where people would be locked in, never allowed to move back to the rest of Gaza. They are kept there, surrounded by an ocean of Israeli soldiers with a ginormous buffer zone that Israel itself calls an extermination zone. If you step a foot there, you're neutralized, you're murdered on first sight. Inside that camp, it would be run by the proxy gangs that Israel had cultivated that have links to ISIS, that are drug dealers, sexual predators, murderers, collaborators, etc. In the New Rafah itself, it is a Potemkin's village. It's supposed to be there as a showroom of what Israel will pretend its intentions in Gaza are, which is, look, here's a nice area with a pretend population of 25,000 people. We're giving them food. We're giving them shelter. It's not our fault that the rest of Gaza is a howling wilderness and a wasteland. It's Hamas's fault. It's Hamas not playing ball with Trump. Well, look, we're not doing a genocide because New Rafah is a testament to this. If you look at the small print in the New Rafah plan, people there would not be given any housing. There would not be any permanent structure. They would be shipping containers. It's called containerized smart housing solutions. People in the New Rafah would have to submit to thorough, meticulous, around-the-clock biometric surveillance 24/7. They would not be allowed to have any sort of independent thinking. The educational material that would be put there will be imported directly from the Emirates, co-authored by the Israelis, and then spoon-fed to children there. People in that area, they would basically, according to Ari Lightstone, the grand architect of that New Rafah plan, they would have only one freedom, and that is the freedom to move into Egypt and beyond. Quite literally. That's the only freedom that they would have. They don't have the freedom to go back to West Gaza. It's only to Egypt and beyond. Otherwise, you stay stuck there. You get food rations that are distributed on a daily basis with this biometric surveillance. Otherwise, you're good for dead. The idea of New Rafah was born out of two precedents. One is Syria. Back in the first Trump administration, there was the idea of New Syria, Old Syria, West and East. And they were divided by the Euphrates. And Trump's administration were talking about East Syria, the area run by the Kurds, becoming a new Dubai, a new Singapore, a new whatever. And it turned out to be a scam. They kept talking about that New Syria would have reconstruction money, funding, it would prosper. West Syria under the Syrian government would be sanctioned, buried under sanctions. People there would starve to death. It would wither and die, and people there would be begging, kicking, and screaming to be allowed into East Syria. That was one precedent. The other one is the genocide in Myanmar. So the Burmese government is accused of genocide. They resort, a lot of European governments join the filing at the ICC and say it is a genocide, although they use the exact same argument that they deny when it comes to Gaza. But as soon as that issue becomes a debacle to the Burmese government, they resort to a PR stunt. And that was to create what is called a model village. They created two model villages that are housing at most 314 Rohingya families out of 1.2 million people that were kicked out to Bangladesh. And people in those two model villages are caged in, are basically prisoners. And the housing that they have there, it's called dwellings. It doesn't have a bathroom, doesn't have a kitchen. There's no communal kitchen. There's no electricity. There's no infrastructure. There's no transport. And that's exactly the blueprint for New Rafah. And on top of this, the people that would design this very primitive cage, I saw an image of the rendering, what it should look like. It looked like a prison from El Salvador. And the people that would design this, they are bragging that they are set to make 300% profit out of this, that they are set to make the most unprecedented lucrative contracts with the most lucrative profits possible in their history. One group that was approached for this is a group called Alligator Alcatraz. It's a group that has been subcontracting for ICE. They built a prison in Florida. The official name of the group is Gotham, from Batman. And basically, Alligator Alcatraz, a friend of mine that interviewed them, spoke to them, investigated the issue. She told me that they had a direct line with Susie Wiles. The head of Alligator Alcatraz was friends with Trump's chief of staff. And that gave them an inside track in the White House to basically get the contract for New Rafah and Gaza and humanitarian aid being allowed into Gaza, as well as commercial trucks, without any bidding or vetting or competition or none whatsoever, without any transparency. And they were promised something to the extent of $1.7 billion. It was mind-blowing to the owners of Alligator Alcatraz. But here's the twist. The owner of the group, according to my friend, she said that the owner of the group was so reluctant and so concerned by the bad PR and the illegality of operating in this concentration camp of New Rafah that he contemplated the idea of creating a subgroup, another company, a fictitious company that would be awarded that contract, and then he would take the profit to his own Alligator Alcatraz. So imagine for a second, a group called Alligator Alcatraz is so terrified of the bad PR that would come after its name, that would tarnish its reputation if they implement Trump's plan for peace, prosperity, and stability. That tells you everything about that Board of Peace.
Muhammad, the New Rafah plan sounds absolutely horrible. We've spoken about different aspects of this in recent weeks. Basically, it's a high-tech biometric concentration camp. Is it going to happen, though? I mean, that's, are they going to pull it off?
Oh, that's a very good question. I don't think that they are even trying to pull it off. So when I spoke to people at CMCC, that's the Center for Military Civilian Coordination that Trump created in Kiryat Gat to implement his so-called ceasefire peace plan, whatever. So basically people there, they understood that New Rafah is unworkable. It's unimplementable. You cannot just expect that people would run begging for shelter, begging for room in this concentration camp, only if you dump a few more kilos of food for them on the road, then they would run immediately there. It doesn't work like Roadrunner, where you just scatter around some crumbs of bread and then the people would come running mindlessly. They understood that. They understood that there's the other problem of the gangs that are in that area, the proxy gangs that are notorious for taking part in the starvation, in the creation of Israel's famine in Gaza. And people understand, like people in Gaza are not stupid. Neither are the people at CMCC. They understand this is unworkable. And that's why, like, the idea of New Rafah, it started with the ambition of having 500,000 there. Then it went down to 25,000. From 500,000 to 25,000 is a giant, significant downgrade. And it is basically the understanding that it's unworkable. But at the same time, I saw an Israeli estimate that said there is about 20,000 people in East Gaza. That is the gangs, their families, and people that they lured in. I spoke to a journalist that interviewed people that were formerly part of the Abu Shabab gang. They said that anyone that moved into the Abu Shabab area is dealt with as a prisoner. They're locked in, their cell phones are confiscated, their movement is restricted. They get food rations as inmates in a concentration camp, but they're not allowed back into West Gaza. They're not allowed to move freely, and they're just locked up there. And basically, Israel would not have a difficult time of putting a few caravans together, piecing in this sort of cleared area, and then moving in a pretend population of the gang and their families and people that fled there, and then pretending that this is New Gaza, this is New Rafah. Israel has been doing this already. If you look, there is a center called the Center for Peace Communication in Washington. It's basically, it has one main function, which is to platform those gangs around the clock to try to whitewash them and sell them to the elite in Washington to say that, look, this is New Gaza, this is a new de-radicalized population, those people believe in coexistence, etc. So I have a friend who runs a think tank in DC, and she went to Israel at some point, and she met with representative of the Israeli government, civil society, blah, 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 and they were trying to sell her Abu Shabab, Yasser Abu Shabab, as, quote, a grassroots civil society activist that believes in peace and coexistence. His widow, now Amna Abu Shabab, was just added to the board of an Israeli NGO that works with educational reform, de-radicalization, coexistence, love, peace, happiness, joy, etc. And her name is on the board only as Amna. It doesn't mention the last name Abu Shabab. But it's basically, if you just open any of those websites, Center for Peace Communication, Atlantic Council, Washington Institute for Near East Policy, any of those garbage NGOs in DC, you would find them around the clock trying to platform Abu Shabab and the other gangs as the promise of New Gaza.
And I assume that's the same think tank or the same circles who placed the op-eds in the Wall Street Journal on behalf of Yasser Abu Shabab.
Well, basically, it was a scheme. So there was a center in Israel called the Jerusalem Media Center that would contact newspapers in like the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and others, and they would pitch them, quote, authentic Palestinian voices on the ground. There's also the Center for Peace Communication. I believe it's involved somehow. I did not uncover the full extent of the involvement, but judging by them trying to brand Abu Shabab's widow when he was alive as, quote, the first lady of Rafah, and Abu Shabab as the promised new leader of Gaza, they're predictably very involved in this. And basically, a couple of other of those NGOs that have been working on brandishing a couple of collaborators and selling them to a Western audience and saying, look, this is the new Palestinian intelligentsia. With the Wall Street Journal, they ran this article by Abu Shabab, who notoriously didn't know how to read or write. He dropped out of 4th grade because he was a genius, then turned to drug dealing, joining groups that are linked to ISIS, etc. But there was a more remarkable case with the Washington Post. There were a couple of articles written there by a young Gazan lawyer. And basically, a journalist from the Wall Street Journal itself told me that in both instances, it was the Jerusalem Media Center and some of those NGOs in Washington that got that article published. How did they get in touch with someone in Gaza itself? Well, there's a couple of regional powers that are involved in this. That's another story. But basically, with that instance, they published an article trying to talk about New Rafah, where the war is over, where people are living happily, in peace, having opportunities, everything that life can offer. There's an open buffet of food that never runs. It's the land of milk and honey. And then it took me a couple of minutes to just find a picture with that guy sitting side by side with Yasser Abu Shabab, holding a gun and smiling and cuddling and spooning and whatever. And that article was shared by the White House. It was shared by a lot of American politicians. And then I had a journalist from the Washington Post itself, writing me and saying this article was published without any editorial oversight. We had no idea that it was being pushed through. It probably came from the top.
And just to remind people, of course, that Yasser Abu Shabab is the militia leader, the collaborator. When we had you on the Electronic Intifada podcast in June last year, you spoke to us about those ISIS-linked collaborator gangs, and the most prominent leader was Yasser Abu Shabab, and he ended up being killed by the resistance, it appears, in December. So he is no more, but the collaborator gangs are still there, it seems, according to what you're saying. Nora, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, I mean, I just, and your description of, the new Rafah area. I mean, I couldn't help but remember the stories of Theresienstadt, the model concentration camp that the Nazis in Germany had built to show off how humane and compassionate the Germans were to the Jews and the Roma and everyone else who were being warehoused there, in order to deflect, any sort of accountability or rumors at that time that that people were being sent to the gas chambers. Another aspect of this, of course, you mentioned the center in Kiryat Gat, the Board of Peace, Tony Blair, of course. Palestinians however, are almost totally excluded from the governance of Gaza that the Trump administration is trying to impose, except for the so-called National Committee for the Administration of Gaza. This is a small group of Palestinians handpicked by the United States that will supposedly run local affairs in Gaza. It's nominally headed by someone named Ali Shath. He's a civil engineer originally from Gaza and a former official in the Palestinian Authority. He comes from a family with extensive ties to the Fatah faction run by the PA chief Mahmoud Abbas. Can you give us an update on the NCAG, again, the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, what it's doing, how much actual involvement and on the ground administration it will be allowed to do, if it can do anything, and how much credibility it has on the ground?
Well, basically, one important point that you mentioned, Noura, is the exclusion of Palestinians from governance. It's because the US, the Trump administration, is not planning to have any governance in Gaza, none whatsoever. They just look at this as a commercial opportunity. It's a quick get-rich scam. They basically look at Gaza and see how can we make the most out of it to line up in the pockets of Kushner, his buddies, Trump, his buddies, Ari Lightstone and his buddies, etc. And these are the words of people that are dealing with Ari Lightstone, with Kushner, with Trump that I've spoken to. They keep telling me this whole new Gaza plan, this whole Trump deal is all about getting a lot of people rich, and then that's it. If there is anything that concerns the people of Gaza, it would be relegating them to cheap labor, to a tax haven that would be established there with tax-free startups with zero regulations. That is basically the report that came out in Israel's Channel 12 many months ago. It came out, I think, about 6 or 7 months ago, laid out the footprint of what was announced at that Board of Peace meeting. It basically said Larry Ellison, Peter Thiel, Jared Kushner, all of those billionaire buddies, they have their eyes on Gaza as a tax haven where they would exploit the population as cheap labor. That's the end of the story. That's why there's no structure of governance. The Board of Peace, the CMCC is a facade. So you have two American military people, a general, colonels, soldiers, etc., and you have 12 countries that sent a lot of diplomats in. I've spoken to them. There's nothing there. They keep trying to come up with plans. They keep trying to come up with what they call technical solutions, technical middle grounds. And by the time they come up with a plan, Israel would drown them with talking points. For example, something as simple as trying to get tents into Gaza. Israel is saying, no, we're not going to allow any tents into Gaza because the metal, the tiny amount of aluminum that goes into the tent structure can be utilized by Hamas to create weapons of mass destruction. That's the Israeli alibi. And then CMCC would try to rework all sorts of alternative solutions. Maybe we can put some wood inside the tents instead and blah, blah, blah. By the time they figure out something, Israel would bury it. The person in charge of CMCC, the person that reports to Trump and Kushner, is Ari Lightstone, an Orthodox rabbi from New York that was David Friedman's advisor. David Friedman is the American ambassador, the worst ambassador in the U.S. history in Israel, basically a settler, an Israeli settler with an American hat. And what you had there...
That was in the first Trump administration.
Precisely. And now Ari Lightstone has been named as an advisor to the Board of Peace. People that have met him, people that know him well, told me that he is way more right-wing than Netanyahu, way more ideological, and, quote, hates Palestinians with passions. That's the guy that's calling the shots on Gaza. If you look at his staff, he got this guy called Adam Huffman, 25-year-old dude from Princeton. His two gigs in life, his CV is two things. Number one, he used to write in a right-wing newspaper at Princeton to bash the Palestinian student encampments. Say, they're making me feel uncomfortable, unsafe, unloved, unprotected, blah, blah, blah. And appeared a couple of times on Fox News with Pete Hegseth. The other thing is that he worked at Doge. And that's it. And now he's in charge of designing the maps of what Gaza should look like, the residential areas, what New Rafah would look like, and operationalizing all of this. As Ali and I discussed earlier, it sounds very much like Iraq when they would put interns in charge of running ministries or administering Baghdad and other areas in there.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Muhammad, because as we were talking before the interview, 23 years ago, can't believe it's that long ago, when the US invaded Iraq, it was very similar the way they talked about Iraq. You had all these think tanks in Washington, all these ultra right wing free market think tanks who saw Iraq as this blank slate on which they were going to enact all their fantasies, economic fantasies of tax-free, no economic regulations, a complete economic free-for-all, basically a laboratory for everything they wanted to do in the United States and the rest of the world. But of course, Iraq afforded them that opportunity because they controlled it. They invaded it. They destroyed the government. They dismissed the army. So they felt like the masters of the universe. And I remember from that time, they put in all of these just, interns, these nobodies from the right-wing spheres in the US, people just out of college who had no idea what they were doing, but were suddenly put in charge of, major issues in Iraq. So it is a repetition of that, but it is even more grotesque. The genocide is, I don't want to minimize what the United States did in Iraq by any stretch, but in Gaza, it's certainly more intense as a proportion of the population. The population in Gaza is much smaller. But, what an irony that Trump ran in 2016 on criticizing the Iraq war, and on his watch, the same utter horrors are being repeated and multiplied.
Precisely. And it's like gross by any metric that you take. So basically, the UN, the World Bank, they put the cost of Gaza's reconstruction at about 60 to 70 billion dollars. Trump just doubled that. He put it on 120 billion. You can guess where the rest of the money would go. Basically, with INCAG, the new government, the committee that is supposed to run Gaza, I spoke to people in the committee. I spoke to people close to Dr. Ali. I listened to his interviews before assuming position in that committee. He seemed like a decent guy, very thoughtful. He was very critical minded. And I refer in the past tense was because as soon as he joined INCAG, he just became a puppet. His statements are given to him by Mladenov, by Blair, etc., to be published or read out loud. So a ChatGPT would have done just as well. Basically, with Dr. Ali, before joining NCAG, he did a couple of interviews where he takes pride in Palestinian resistance, even in armed resistance, refers to martyrs, people that have been martyred in Gaza, talks proudly about the sumud, resilience, is extremely critical of Israel, Israel's occupation, apartheid. He uses a lot of the basic common sense terminology that we all agree upon, the international community or the human rights community. As soon as he joins NCAG, all of that disappears completely. I spoke to a personal friend of his, a woman that has known Ali for about 30 years. She said, well, the Gaza committee is the distraction. It's just a facade. There's nothing there. There's nothing at all, none. I spoke to commissioners in that committee. They told me they had more questions than answers. One of them literally said, well, probably, Muhammad, you know better than us exactly what is happening at the moment. I was like, I have no idea what is happening. And he was like, exactly, because we were told nothing. So, for example, that committee was formed over a month ago. They were supposed to come into Gaza immediately, take charge of the government, take over from Hamas's government, take over the police, the ministries, etc. Until now, they remain a government in exile, stuck in Egypt. Not allowed, not a single one of them allowed into Gaza. With that committee, they have not been told up until this very moment, where would they sleep if they go into Gaza? Where would they live? Where would they work? Which kind of staff would they have? What kind of budget would they have? They have none of those answers. They met with the Palestinian Red Crescent in Egypt, and the representative of the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, they started to ask some practical questions. They were like, okay, are you going to provide sort of like a welfare payment or a salary to the widows of paramedics, ambulance men, and doctors that were killed by Israel's genocide? And they were like, we have no idea. We were never told. The only substantial meeting that they were allowed to have in Gaza or on the transfer of power in Gaza was with the municipalities to talk about sanitation, water, humanitarian aid, garbage disposal, and that's it. Nothing more, nothing government-wise. Blair met them reportedly and told them, you're not going to play a role with politics whatsoever. None, zero. And you're not going to play a role with disarmament and security. This is all left to the Israelis to trump to mercenaries, private contractors, etc. The other thing about the committee is that Israel deliberately tried everything possible to put that committee on a collision course with the Palestinian society at large. So, for example, the commissioner of security, the guy that's supposed to take over the police in Gaza, that's supposed to take over the process of decommissioning, regulating arms, whatever, stability, ceasefire enforcement, is a collaborator. Sami Nasman was sentenced by a court in Gaza for 50, he was sentenced about 15 years in prison for espionage. And he was allegedly personally responsible for the murder of 2 leaders of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. I spoke to someone, a prominent Palestinian journalist that investigated this story. He said that he was the guy that fired the shots that killed them personally. He was basically allegedly he was recruiting cells in Gaza. Members of those cells pointed the finger of blame at him. He was an intelligence officer in Ramallah, and he was recruiting cells in Gaza to burn and blow up vehicles and public infrastructure, to destabilize, create riots, create chaos, etc. And that's the guy that Israel allowed to be in charge of security in Gaza. With Ali Sha'at, he's not allowed to go into any meeting without Sami Nasman being like his shadow, tailing him everywhere. He was just in Turkey, met with Hakan Fidan, the Turkish foreign minister. Sami Nasman is there. He was just had a meeting in Egypt with the European Union ambassador. Sami Nasman is there. And Israel is ensuring that Sami Nasman remains in the picture, although every single Palestinian faction in Gaza has objected to that name and said that Sami needs to be replaced. Israel is still very sort of uncompromising on it. There's another dimension. Half of those committee members are people that are affiliated with Muhammad Dahlan. The Palestinian strongman, used to be a Fatah leader, exiled to the United Arab Emirates. He's the advisor of Mohammed bin Zayed, the president of the United Arab Emirates. And Dahlan is basically, if you take Abu Mazen's word, is notorious for all sorts of illegal wrongdoings, corruption, espionage, etc. If you take the words of any public reporting about Dahlan, you will find footprints in Ethiopia, in Sudan, in Libya, in Yemen, mashallah, all over the map. He's very active. And basically, half of the committee members are Dahlan's guys. I even saw a cable that was sent by the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv to Washington to describe members of the committee. And then they go through name by name, and they say, this guy, Dahlan, this guy, Dahlan, that guy, Dahlan. The committee members, the only thing they know is that they are getting a very hefty paycheck to keep them in line. They get about $18,000 per month to sit on that committee. That is paid by the UAE. They are the ones that are supporting the budget for that committee, or for the salaries of the 15 members of it. But even if the committee members were to enter Gaza, they have no idea where are they going to operate, in East Gaza and West Gaza, and they have on their tail the Israeli collaborating proxy groups, Abu Shabab and others, that are publicly threatening to arrest, execute members of the committee. So Abu Shabab's gang, they issued a public declaration vowing to retaliate against Abu Salman al-Maghani. He's a minister in the committee, or commissioner in charge of societal reconciliation, societal affairs. And they said, that guy is an outlaw. We're going to apprehend him as soon as he comes into Gaza. And that gang, Israel set up for them a checkpoint right at the Rafah border crossing. People that have been allowed to enter Gaza, which is a very, very fractional, insignificant minority. It's in the single digits. People that were allowed to enter Gaza, they would get abducted immediately by those gang members. Everything that they have is confiscated and stolen. They get blindfolded, beaten up, harshly interrogated, and then delivered to the Israelis, to an Israeli checkpoint, where there would be further interrogation, and then they would be allowed or caged into West Gaza, and that's it. So the committee, all in all, is just a facade to buy time. It's the same as New Rafah. The idea, like with Witkoff, there was this question that was puzzling me for so long. If Kushner, Trump, and all of those guys are talking about New Rafah, and New Rafah is the area that's going to be rebuilt, why are they allowing Israel until this very moment to destroy every single standing home and public infrastructure in that very new area, in that New Rafah? Israel just blew up the largest water distillation facility in that New Rafah. So why are they allowing this? And I posed that question to European diplomats, to CMCC, to experts, and no one is giving an answer. And Witkoff, a couple of days ago, he gave an interview in which he spoke proudly, calmly, casually, that once Israel is done with all the destruction and demolition, then we're going to start with a clean slate, with a sort of like a blank canvas from which Gaza would be rebuilt to their own liking. Again, their own liking is just a scam.
Yeah.
You're going to dump in there shipping containers, cage people in there. A shipping container in the summer turns into a baking oven. In the winter, it's metal. So any sound of wind or raindrops would drive you insane. It's unlivable.
Yeah.
And these outside groups handpicked by Trump and Witkoff and Tony Blair are just going to make millions, billions in profits. You mentioned this notion that the Trump administration is working very hard to disarm Hamas, and the plan itself, Trump's plan, was predicated on the idea that Hamas already agreed to unilaterally disarm as part of the ceasefire, the fraudulent ceasefire deal. And, of course, this is not, in fact, the case. Hamas and other resistance groups in Gaza have repeatedly made clear that they're not just going to lay down their arms. But Trump also continuously threatens that if Hamas does not disarm, something that the Israelis couldn't make them do after 2.5 years of genocide, by the way, it will be done by force. He constantly says there will be hell to pay or hell will be unleashed, all of this rhetoric. And Israel seems to be renewing its threats to resume a full-scale assault in Gaza, especially since there are no captives and bodies of captives left. How do you understand this issue, and have any countries projected to be part of Trump's so-called international stabilization force agreed to fight the Palestinian people on Israel's and America's behalf? Where do you see this right now?
Well, basically, there's two things here. Number one, the International Stabilization Force. Every single country that tried to sign up to that force previously was either vetoed by Israel or persuaded by Israel behind closed doors to pull back. So Azerbaijan was one of the countries that are very close to the Israelis, are also very close to Turkey, and they offered to join ISF. And then Israel, I have it on good word from a senior Arab mediator. He said Israel, Netanyahu sent an envoy to Azerbaijan to convince them to pull out of the ISF. And then they withdrew. They said, we're not going to join anymore. Turkey was the first to say, we will join ISF because they're close to Hamas, to other Palestinian factions, to Trump, etc. And they thought, okay, maybe we can have a sort of a foot on the ground and we can do things right. Netanyahu vetoed it immediately. Qatar wanted to join as well. Netanyahu vetoed it. Indonesia joined, but not with military force. Indonesia was very clear. It's going to be a force of, or it's going to be troops that are sent there under a military umbrella, but they would be medics, engineers, humanitarian workers. The Kyrgyzstan thought about joining. There's now about 5 countries that signed up rhetorically. Again, the word here is rhetorically. There's nothing official on paper yet. All of them signed up on the day the Board of Peace meeting was happening. Because the Board of Peace meeting, you all saw it. It was just a theater where Trump would give a speech for 2 hours. All of them are groveling as hard as they could. None of them is allowed to say anything other than yes, sir, and that's it. So all of them were eager to please Trump, and none of them wanted to be on the bad foot, lest be kidnapped in the middle of the night like Venezuela's president. So what you have there is countries pledging to join ISF. There's nothing on paper. There's nothing official yet. So you have now Morocco, Indonesia, 3 more, and they would be distributed. Each part of Gaza would have a different government. Even with that installation, none of those countries agreed to play any role whatsoever in what is called counterinsurgency or in disarmament or in policing. All of them are there either as Indonesia to be medical workers, engineers, humanitarian workers, or to be a buffer zone, oversight over the police, providing training to the police. All of it is symbolic. It's the same as what the Jordanian king did when he met Trump. Trump was pressuring Jordan very hard to take in a significant amount of people from Gaza to ethnically cleanse it. And the Jordanian king was very clever about it. He just went to Trump and said, I'm going to take 2,000 cancer patients. Trump doesn't have an eye for detail. He heard it was like as big as the universe, a giant gesture. And those countries, they learned how to play Trump as well. We're going to join that ISF. Nothing is going to happen. And take my word for it. Mark my word. I'm going to remind you of it soon enough when you see some of those countries pulling out. Because whenever we were close to countries actually sending troops to ISF, Netanyahu would put clear demands on the table that ISF should be a subcontractor of the Israeli army, of the Israeli genocidal forces, that ISF should kill, murder, maim, shoot, detain Palestinians in Gaza, destroy tunnels, look for weapons, collect intelligence, deliver all of that to Israel. Clear. ISF would not be allowed to operate even a drone to protect themselves, because the drone might be considered a threat to Israeli forces. That's how paranoid they are. The other component of the question about what would things would look like, and you remind me of the other half. Sorry, I lost track of my thoughts. I didn't have coffee for the last 2 weeks.
The disarmament,
Disarmament.
Muhammad.
Yeah.
I mean, it's Trump and U.S. officials like Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff and others keep insisting that Hamas agreed to disarm.
Yeah.
They, in fact, never agreed to disarm. So what's the resolution to that? They keep saying, you better disarm or we're going to do it. Israel spent more than 2 years perpetrating a genocide. They could not defeat the resistance in Gaza or disarm them. Where is this issue heading?
Yep. With disarmament, Trump is not pushing for it. They keep talking about it, but they're not pushing for it at all. Neither are the Israelis. It's another scam. So disarmament is basically, until this very moment, as we speak, Hamas was never given any official proposal for what disarmament would look like. Nikolai Miladinov, the High Representative of the Board of Peace for Gaza, he kept talking about disarmament as well, decommissioning, disarmament, demilitarization. And then he met with Khalil al-Hayya and other Hamas leaders in Egypt, in Cairo. He never brought it up. They never even delivered any broad idea, any blueprint, any brainstorming, none whatsoever, none, zero. So up until this moment, as we speak, Hamas was not allowed to engage in any discussion with the mediators or the US government on what disarmament would look like, because disarmament already happened. Gaza, Netanyahu himself, a few days ago, he gave a speech in which he said, well, Gaza doesn't have any major rockets. Gaza doesn't have any major weapons. Gaza doesn't have weapons of mass destruction. They don't have artillery fire. They don't have tanks. They don't have. And then at the end, he explained what he means is the Kalashnikovs, the pistols, the rifles, and none of those present a threat to Israel itself. They do present a threat to the Israeli army inside Gaza, because that means an insurgency can be sustained for as long as it takes. Because an insurgency, it doesn't take much for an insurgency, guerrilla warfare, to be sustained. Sleeping cell here, a Kalashnikov here, a Kalashnikov there, an ambush once a week, and that's it. You give them a very sleepless time. But basically, with the talk about disarmament, so it falls down to two components. There's what is called offensive weapons, defensive weapons. Offensive is supposed to be the rockets, anything that can be fired at Israel itself, not at the IDF, but at Israel, beyond the confines of Gaza. And that a framework was developed by Egypt, by Saudi Arabia, Britain as well, where there would be an idea of what is called decommissioning. So it would be something like Northern Ireland. Hamas has been heavily depleted. Israeli intelligence assessment itself, they say Hamas is not rearming. They're only reorganizing. They're only filling the empty vacancies, the ranks, the vacuum here and there, but they don't have the capacity to produce rockets at the rate that they had before October 7th. The biggest indication of this is that Netanyahu, a couple of days ago, went and announced opening an airport right next to Gaza in the Negev. And that idea of that particular airport had been shelved in Israel for decades because of any fear that Hamas could fire rockets at it, and that's it. The airport would be paralyzed. Netanyahu went there and said verbatim, quote, "We had a problem with Gaza, now it's solved. There's no threat anymore." So the whole disarmament talk is just a mirage. It's a facade.
Although, to be fair, there was never any sign that Hamas was running low on the weapons it used to confront the Israeli army inside Gaza, the kinds of weapons that our colleague John Elmer has documented and shown us over the past 2+ years. Although you may well be right about long-range rockets, but clearly Hamas has said they're not going to disarm, and nobody can force them to do so. So I guess it remains to be seen how that impasse plays out. But I want to sort of...
the Egyptian proposal for disarmament is basically, it would not be any disarmament at all. It would be a policy of no use, no display. So you put the weapons in a depot, in a warehouse. You don't use them. There's a cessation of hostilities mutually, both by Israel's side, by Gaza's side, etc. No armed activities whatsoever, Israeli withdrawal, etc. Northern Ireland. And you have that kind of framework for a decade. If there's a solution to the conflict at the end of it, those weapons would be destroyed. If there is not, then
and that is that's an interesting discussion we should come back to one day. But those are ideas borrowed from the Northern Ireland framework, except in the Northern Ireland framework there was reciprocity. The Irish resistance groups would take one step, the British and the loyalists would take one step, and so on. That's not what we ever talk about when it comes to Palestine. When it comes to Palestine, it's that unilateral surrender by the Palestinians. It's what's demanded, and unchecked continued murder and mayhem by Israel, as much as they want. As we've seen, more than 600 Palestinians at this point, or close to that number, killed during the so-called ceasefire. So they take, the flavor of these ideas without the substance, and they try to impose it on the situation. But that might be a discussion for another day, a very interesting one. Muhammad, I want to turn to this article that you wrote recently for the European Council on Foreign Relations, where you're a visiting fellow, headlined "Dispelling Trump's Dystopia, a European Blueprint for Gaza's Renewal." And in it, you lay out many of the criticisms we've just heard you make, and you warn of the catastrophe that will occur if Trump and his co-conspirators are allowed to get away with their Gaza scam and just to exploit it and try to make a quick buck. You write, quote, "To prevent this and perhaps prompt Washington to rethink its disturbing vision, Europeans, alongside key partners like Egypt, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey, need to present a political and financial counteroffer that respects Palestinian needs." And I want to challenge you a bit on this, Muhammad. The European states, with a few minor exceptions, have fully supported Israel's genocide and Trump's plans, and they continue to provide unconditional support to Israel, including with trade, which is fueling its intensifying ethnic cleansing and colonization across the occupied West Bank. Arab and other regional regimes, including those you mentioned, are also fully on board and seemingly incapable of asserting any sovereignty or independence from Washington. You write another thing, Muhammad. You say, Europeans need to emphasize that reconstruction can be a means to empower non-Hamas governance and counter Israeli efforts to marginalize Palestinian decision-making. I also want to challenge you on this point. Why is it the business of the EU or anyone else to meddle in Palestinian affairs and to try to determine who leads the Palestinian people? Is it not time to finally tell the colonial countries to stop interfering in Palestinian self-determination and democracy, indeed blocking Palestinian self-determination? And one more point, I'm just going through the points in the article that stood out to me, and then you can have the floor to respond how you like. You also call for activities aimed at, quote, advancing Palestinian reunification, including between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority and other factions. But you don't address the elephant in the room, which is that the Palestinian Authority continues to actively and aggressively collaborate with Israel against the Palestinian people and their internationally recognized right to resist. How can there be unity and reconciliation between those who, on the one hand, uphold the right to resist occupation, and those, on the other hand, who insist on collaborating with occupation? The Europeans don't take that approach in Ukraine. There, the EU actively assists resistance and sanctions persons and entities that they consider to be collaborating with occupation authorities in Russian-controlled parts of Ukraine. Why should the approach be different in Palestine? Muhammad, you wrote a very interesting article. I agree with all the analysis you've given in this article, but why did you make those points in your article that I'm challenging you on?
And basically, with a policy article, you always need to come up with recommendations. And as I was drafting those, I was telling my colleague, none of this is going to happen. None of this is going to be done. You're talking to a dead corpse. I have zero expectations of European or Arab governments. There's a European diplomat that told me to my face, a French diplomat. She said to me something like, there are leaders that want the genocide in Gaza to happen, that are pleased with it happening, because they view Palestinians as an economic burden. They see us as ungrateful, hungry mouths. That was the verbatim quote that she told me. And they see us as a political nuisance. And that if we are gone, if Israel succeeds to ethnically cleanse Gaza and the West Bank and just burn all of it, that wouldn't be a bad thing for them. They wanted the genocide to happen. There's even an Arab leader, and I have this verbatim quote from an Arab leader to some American diplomat. Within the meeting, he says verbatim, if Israel burns the Temple Mount, he doesn't even use Al-Aqsa. He says, if Israel burns the Temple Mount to the ground, so what? It's just another mosque. So I don't expect anything of them. So the part about recommendations, you always need to be realistic. And at the same time, if you try to be realistic, you wouldn't recommend anything. So you need to articulate something that sounds possible, and while having the full knowledge that none of it is going to happen. Why you need to do this? It's because European and Arab governments have been telling us for the last 3 to 4 months that the only reason why they accepted the Trump plan, the only reason why they're playing along with it, it's because it's the only plan in town. There's no other way of doing business. And if we want to stop the genocide in Gaza, if we want things to move forward, we have to indulge in this Trump plan. So basically, I'm trying to say, no, there's a million plans out there. Look, here, I'm a nobody that just came up with a plan in the moment of in 3 minutes, just came up with a plan for you of what you need to do. You have all those bureaucrats, you have this enormous machine. I'm always struck by how giant those European bureaucracies are, and at the same time, how imbecilic, incompetent, and ignorant they are. And I learned through time that the ignorance is deliberate. For example, there's an Israeli activist that brought with him to Europe Israeli soldiers that carried out the genocide in Gaza to give testimonies to European decision makers to say, look, here's what we did. And the testimony was very simple. We used people like dogs, human shields, we used them like dogs. That was the verbatim quote. We destroyed everything in our face. We killed everyone in our face. We emptied our machine guns indiscriminately. We declared this area as an extermination zone. That was the testimony. And they went to meet with European governments. A lot of those European leaders refused to even meet them. Those are Israeli soldiers. They are your favorite. They're your kids. It's like you're always praising Israel, a democracy, blah, 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 blah. The democracy is coming to talk to you. It's asking for 5 minutes, and they don't want to meet them. The ignorance is deliberate. So when I try to make some of those unrealistic, realistic recommendations, it's there to just make a point. Look, there is a million other ways of doing business. Stop telling us that Trump's plan is the only plan in town and it needs to be implemented. There's the other dimension about sort of leveraging reconstruction to enhance non-Hamas government. Non-Hamas, it was added editorially. My own sentence was Palestinian government, but non-Hamas is because Hamas agreed to step down from government in Gaza. That is basically Hamas's position at the moment. They agreed to hand over everything in Gaza from A to Z. And it's just added there editorially to appeal to European decision makers to be like, look, there's an opportunity here, etc. But the essence of it, it boils down to this. After the 2014 Israeli assault on Gaza, reconstruction was entrusted to the UN, to UNRWA. And You had UNRWA being in charge of the reconstruction in Gaza. So our late friend Rifat al-Arair, Allah yarhamu, Rifat, his home was destroyed by Israel. It was bombed by Israel. And then he had, I remember the days where him and I, Yusuf al-Jamal, would meet with people from UNRWA to try to ask questions like, when is he going to get his home rebuilt? How is he going to get it rebuilt? When is he going to get compensation? When is anything going to happen? And they didn't have any answers. And basically, the missed opportunity here is that reconstruction, if it was given to the Palestinian government, whether the Palestinian Authority, the Hamas, the Palestinian government in Gaza, etc., any Palestinian entity at all, if it is a Palestinian government that's delivering the reconstruction of Gaza, it would enhance the legitimacy of that government in the eyes of the Palestinian public. So that was my point there. But in terms of European meddling, yeah, that's a very long tradition. This sort of conferring legitimacy on people they like and withholding it from others. And it boils down to sort of like interpersonal traits. So, for example, European diplomats would always love to meet with a certain Palestinian expert, and it's because that expert has a habit of drinking too much. So they can feel that guy is more relatable than meeting with a religious sheikh that is sitting and not shaking hands with women and looking down and blah, blah, blah. There's a lot to tell about those stories. My head is going to explode with those behind-the-scenes European garbage. But basically, there's the point of European meddling in Palestinian politics. It's been there forever, American, etc. With Palestinian reconciliation, I once met a guy that used to work at the American consulate in Jerusalem. He said he was given a main job. Whenever Hamas and Fatah tried to have a reconciliation talk, he would get a call from DC telling him, go and ruin it, sabotage it today. And he would need to make a couple of phone calls to the Palestinian Authority, to Mahmoud Abbas, to others, and say Washington vetoes this reconciliation agreement. And that takes me to my final point. With European governments, what they need to do traditionally, if you ask any Fatah leader, if you ask any Hamas leader, why is Hamas not allowed into the PLO? Why is the PLO now basically a congregation of senile, demented people above the age of 90? The median age there is 90. Most of them are wearing diapers. None of them is elected. Why is that the body that is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, internationally recognized, etc.? We need more Palestinian factions to join in to inject new blood. Well, the answer is always, it's because if a single person joins the PLO without European, American approval, the PLO would collapse. It would be boycotted, defunded, unrecognized, etc. So, and at the same time, like, I understand your points of criticism about the Palestinian Authority, but for me, politics is about what works, not what feels good. And it's secondary nature. Like, what is it that is going to work within the constraints of the political reality around us? And I would resort to something that was said by Saleh Arouri, the deputy head of Hamas, in 2020. He said, we tried A, B, C, D, and he listed armed resistance, nonviolent resistance, elections, reconciliation talks. None of it worked. And he said, we need an entry point to reviving Palestinian politics. And that entry point is the legitimacy, this contested legitimacy. Who's the legitimate authority? We need to turn to our people, to the Palestinian public, and say, who do you want to be the legitimate representative and on what platform? And to get there, you need to take it like baby steps. You need to take, as we say in Arabic, تَخُدْهُمْ عَلَى أَدْعَائِلْهُمْ, and speak to them to their level of comprehension, and basically people that are senile, demented, etc. So you need to find a way to talk to them with baby steps. Let's go for elections. You're going to be the future Nelson Mandela if you go for elections. And once you're at that point, once you have Palestinian elections where the Palestinian public is given a voice again, all of those things would be put on a national referendum. The security collaboration, the autocratic nature, the security crackdown, the police state, all of it would be given to the Palestinian people to decide what happens with it.
Well, Muhammad, we only have a minute or two left, but and I'm sorry to do this, but we'd like to get your reaction to the comments of U.S. Ambassador Mike Huckabee in his recent interview with Tucker Carlson. I know many people have seen it already, but let's watch a few seconds together.
Where we started. I'm not going to let you off on this because you have said it 3 times that God gave this land to this people. And so it is entirely fair for me with respect to ask, what land are you talking about? Because I just read Genesis 15, as I have many times. And that land, I think it says, from the Nile to the Euphrates, which is, once again, basically the entire Middle East. So God gave that land to his people, the Jews, or he didn't. You're saying he did. What does that mean? Does Israel have the right to that land? Because you're appealing to Genesis.
Yeah.
You're saying that's the original deed.
It would be fine if they took it all.
He says it would be fine if they took it all. Of course, this has produced a firestorm in the region, with many Arab and other governments condemning Huckabee's comments. But was he saying anything that we did not already know about U.S. and Israeli policy, not just over the last, few months since this fraudulent ceasefire, not just, since the last 2.5 years of this genocide, but as a decades and decades old policy? They do seek total regional domination, if not outright annexation of these countries, do they not? And if that's the case, how should these countries be responding beyond these, statements of condemnation and finger wagging and, statements of, shock and dismay?
Well, basically, this whole performance is reminding me of an SNL sketch, a Saturday Night Live sketch about who loves Israel more. It was a hearing at the Senate with, I believe, the Obama nominee for the Minister of Defense. And back then, the SNL sketch is basically members of Congress that are posing a question. If Netanyahu comes to you and he's the greatest leader ever and say, it is important, it is an existential issue for Israel that you fillet a donkey, would you do it? And every one of them is like, give me the donkey, give me the donkey. So it's basically that kind of shenanigan. But at the same time, it speaks of a deeper thing. It is a mentality that is so widespread in Israel, is that all of this area is ours. It's ours from the river to the river. People in the Likud in particular, they would sing it as a sort of like an anthem or as a mourning song, in which they sing about the river and the river, between the two rivers. And it's not the Jordanian River and the sea. No, it's the Nile River and the Euphrates, Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, etc. Even the liberal leader of Yesh Atid, the liberal leader of the Israeli opposition, Yair Lapid, he was asked the same question. Huckabee is saying blah, 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 blah. Do you believe in these things? And he said, yes, absolutely. And the only reason we're not going for this vast, big, ginormous land of Israel from the river to the river is political constraints in that particular moment, today. So if the situation changes tomorrow, we're happy to take all of it. And that's the only thing stopping them.
Yeah.
And, I'll just say one thing on this before we close, Muhammad. Yesterday here in Amman, I went to see Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur, speak. There was 1,000 people, literally, at this enormous hotel ballroom that was just packed with people to hear her speak. And she spoke about this statement by Huckabee, and she said, a lot of people dismiss it and have been dismissing it for years, this idea of the Greater Israel, even though the Israelis themselves are very open and clear and always have been. And as you just said, it's from right to so-called left. Yair Lapid is allegedly the Israeli left or liberal opposition leader. And she said, if we understand it as, actual Israeli sovereignty, stretching their borders to the Nile and to the Euphrates, then yes, maybe it is far-fetched. But if we understand it as domination of control, direct or indirect control of these governments, of being able to bomb wherever they want, enter wherever they want, sow chaos wherever they want, then yes, it's very real and it's very close. And I was sort of, here, there's a lot of talk about it. All the governments in the region issued statements, outraged. And my view is that, why are you so outraged by a statement more than you're outraged by the reality? And it's a reality that you as regimes have all been assisting. You've all been giving Israel this free hand to do what it wants in the region, and working with Israel and the United States against any opposition to it for the most part. So, this is where it gets to when you don't put up any kind of real opposition to it. Muhammad, I'm going to give myself the last word there, although it's wonderful to listen to you. You are full of facts and analysis. You are very thoughtful in how you approach this. People can find you on social media, on Twitter X in particular, where you are extremely prolific and you bring up facts that I don't learn from anywhere else. So I really value what you do. Of course, you are a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, where they sometimes insert editorial words into your articles to make them more palatable to a European audience and perhaps to funders. This is my analysis. I'm not, you're not responsible for anything I say. That perhaps you wouldn't entirely subscribe to yourself. That's okay. We understand the environment that you're existing in and trying to make an impact and a positive difference in. And we appreciate your efforts doing that, Muhammad. The work you do, the analysis you provide is extremely valuable. And thank you for sharing it with us on the Electronic Intifada live stream.
Thank you, Muhammad.
Thanks so much for having me.